Alright, hey everybody. Today we're going to talk about the elements of design. We're not going to get super in depth, but we're going to talk about some basic elements. The first element we're going to talk about is line. A line is a long, narrow mark through space. In the case of drawing, lines have a lot of different qualities to them. So you can have lines that are thicker, that are thinner. You can have lines that are graceful and elegant. You can have lines that are sketchy and shaggy, or lines that are bold. With this drawing, the lines that are used are mostly diagonal. We don't have a lot of horizontal lines like we have right here at the end. And the artist chose to do this to give you a sense of a busy, peopled cityscape. It's a fairly simple line drawing. If you look at things like just the tree or this car here, they're not super complex in the way that they're rendered, but the overall effect is very powerful. So line is an extremely expressive element of design. Here's an example of line used in sculpture. This is an artist named Alexander Calder who uses wire to build three-dimensional objects, but the primary element of design that he's using here is line. Here's another line drawing. These lines they move directions and they meander. They're kind of sketchy. If you focus on just like one little area, the lines aren't that impressive, but if you get back and you notice the overall effect, the drawing has a nice sense of depth to it. It even has a sense of movement that's really interesting, and that's all derived from the artist's use of line. The next portion of this first unit is going to be focusing on this element of design, and that is value. When I say value, I'm not talking about how much something is worth. I'm talking about the use of light and shadow. In this, this is actually a photograph and not a drawing, but in this photograph, value is used to create an emotional sense. And here's another example of emotion being expressed through value. This is a drawing. It's a charcoal drawing that was done by a student of mine in the same drawing class that you guys are taking now. This was done a few years ago. In this image, the artist has used very dark value, very dark shadows, with a nice light area here. Gives you a sense that it's at the nighttime. We have this rhythmic repetition of shapes through the lanterns. Gives us a sense that maybe there's some kind of festival going on. We don't see any people, but there's a nice sense of rhythm and of dark and light that's established through this, through the use of value in this piece. Very different sense of value established here because most of the values are very light and soft. We can't see a whole lot through here. We have this nice little line that guides our eyes through. The darkest values are here, and that was used strategically to make it so that you would focus most of your attention here. The light values through the body and through the blanket are to give you a sense of warmth, peace, innocence. And then the darker values here are to get you to focus on the baby's eyes. So value is something that can be used in many different expressive ways, and it's one of the more important elements of design. Here's contrast. Contrast is when there's a strong difference between light and dark. Also in this image we have an example of pattern, right? It's a really interesting repeating pattern. Pattern oftentimes is used in conjunction with contrast. Contrast is important because it grabs your eye. It demands your attention. It makes you want to look. Here's another example of contrast with a sculpture. So the sculpture is black and put against a white background. It makes it stand out. We have contrast here, also black and white, but this image is a good example of another element of design, and that is negative space. Please don't get confused when I say negative space. A lot of times students will hear me use that word negative and think that it means it's bad. Negative space is not poorly used space. Negative space is referring to the space within or around an object that is not the object. So we have an old-timey gramophone here, and this little space that's not the gramophone looks like a bird. With this piece, the negative space, and these are actually made out of clay. This is not a computer rendered image or a drawing, but the negative space here is the body of a person. There is no person there, but the negative space, the space between the objects, has created a recognizable shape. Negative space doesn't always have to make something recognizable. Sometimes it just makes interesting shapes. So this piece is a good example of the element of design, shape, but it's also a good example of negative space. So we have all these interesting circular shapes, and between those circular shapes we have these curving triangular forms and moon-shaped forms. There's a lot of different interesting shapes created by the space in between the circular shapes, right? So the space in between that creates shapes is called negative space. All right, so shape, next element of design. So these are round shapes, triangular shapes. Different shapes have different expressive power. So the shapes here, circular, the lines are moving in a graceful, smooth pattern, whereas the angles are hard with this one, with these triangular and trapezoidal forms and shapes that are being created here. If we imagined these shapes as being music, this image, the music that we would use to express what's being expressed here, would be something rhythmic, maybe hip-hop. And the music that we would use to express the emotional impact of these shapes would be something more pleasant, pleasant's subjective. Maybe something more peaceful, like classical music, right? They have different expressive qualities because of the different shapes that are being used here. Next element of design I want to talk about is symmetry as opposed to asymmetry. When something is symmetrical, that means that if you cut it in half, the two sides will look identical to each other. Whereas if something is asymmetrical, the two sides will not be identical to each other. So in the case of this tree-like form, if we cut it in half, the two sides are different. Oftentimes, symmetry is interesting to look at, but it can be a little bit monotonous, especially in a drawing. Asymmetry tends to be more interesting, more dynamic, less predictable. But when we have an image that's asymmetrical, we want to think about how it's balanced. So because the mass on either side is the same, it feels balanced. Let me give you another example of balance, right? This large ball has a different mass to all of these, but the mass of objects on this side of the screen is equal to the combined mass of all of these objects, which makes it look balanced, right? So balance is something that you want to keep in mind whenever you have an asymmetrical image. The next one I want to talk about is rhythm. Rhythm is created with a repetition of shapes, forms, or lines, right? So we have a repetition created by the apples. We have a whole bunch of apples. And there's also a repetition of lines created by the sticks that are in the apples. With rhythm, you want to think about changing up the way that things are spaced out. If it's the same, constantly the same, perfectly symmetrical, it gets a little bit boring. So there should be a predictable pattern, but there should also be a sense of novelty to it, right? It should switch up a little bit. All right, the last one I want to talk about is dissonance. The word's down here, D-I-S-S-O-N-A-N-C-E. Dissonance means chaos, disorganization, unpredictability. It's a lack of rhythm. In this image, we see a room that's been torn apart, the bed's ripped, the wall has holes in it, everything's in disarray. It looks like an unpleasant place, right? If you were to rent an Airbnb and you showed up and opened the door and this is what you saw when you looked inside, you'd probably call the police. You wouldn't be like, oh, okay, let's go, lay down, go to sleep. Looks like a nice place to live. Dissonance is sometimes something that you want to avoid, unless what you're trying to portray is negative emotion. Dissonance does create a sense of emotion, and that emotion is generally not a happy one. So consider, as you're drawing something, if it's a little bit messy, skewed, disorganized, what that's expressing. Probably what it's expressing is dissonance, and maybe you want to express that, but maybe that's not what you want to say. So you want to consider the lines, the shapes, the colors, if you're painting, and just the sense of organization that exists inside of your drawing, your composition. So let's run through these all one last time. So line can have different expressive qualities. Value, the use of light and dark, so shadow and light, can give you different emotions depending on how you use it. Contrast, as well as pattern. Here's another example of contrast. Dark blacks against bright whites create a strong sense of contrast, which demand your attention. Negative space is the space between objects that are not the objects, but that also have interest when you're looking at a piece. We have negative space here, but we also have shape. Shape is something that can give you a sense of emotional content in a piece. The nature of the shapes will express different things. Symmetry versus asymmetry. Asymmetrical images are more interesting to look at, but you have to think about balance when you have asymmetrical images. Balance is the visual weight in a piece that should feel equal in terms of mass from one side to the other. Rhythm is a repetition of lines or shapes with some variation to give it a sense of interest rather than monotony. And dissonance is a sense of chaos, disorganization, which makes you feel uneasy when you look at a piece. All right. Watch the video again if you didn't catch everything. Make sure you take notes because this is important information. All right, we'll see you guys later.